Joining me now, First Class Father Brad Miner. Welcome to First Class Fatherhood.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Alec.
Let's start right here. How many kids do you have? How many grandkids?
2 sons, 1 granddaughter.
Wow, very cool. All right. If you could, Brad, please just take a second here to hit my listeners with a little bit about your background and what you do.
Yeah, I'm a senior editor of a website called The Catholic Thing, and I'm a senior fellow of the Faith and Reason Institute, which is located in Washington, D.C. I actually am in Pelham Manor, New York. That's where I live, but it's the internet age, so I get down to Washington now and then, not much during the pandemic, needless to say. And before that, I was literary editor of National Review magazine and had a long career as an editor in the book publishing business. And I've written 6 books, 7 books, I guess now. The most recent of which is a third edition of the book we're going to talk about in part today, which is called The Complete Gentleman, which is subtitled The Modern Man's Guide to Chivalry.
Yeah, and we're going to get right into that in a minute here, Brad. So let me just bring it back to the beginning for you here. About how old were you when you first became a dad, and how did becoming a father kind of change your perspective on life?
Well, I was 40 when my older son was born, 42 when my younger son was born. Fatherhood began changing my life before my sons were born, because I realized in my mid 30s, hadn't been married until then, that I really wanted to be a dad. I'd enjoyed very much being my father's son. And so I began imagining these young men. Of course, I didn't know whether they'd be young men or not, but in any case, part of the reason why it's such a joy to have a granddaughter now. And by the way, the new edition of the book is dedicated to her. So anyway, it brought me into a place psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, where I knew I needed to be completely dedicated to them and to my wife. I think when I first got married, I wasn't sure. I knew I wanted to marry her. I love her very much and have for the last 37 years. But I'm not sure that I really understood what I was getting myself into. But that built very quickly. And especially when her name is Sydney, when Sydney got pregnant, then I knew that suddenly everything had to come together for me. And there needed to be particularly, and this is an aspect of the character of the complete gentleman, loyalty. Loyalty is sort of the first of the chivalric virtues that I discuss in the book. It is essential. I knew that they needed to depend on me and that I would be there for them every step of the way. And that's the way it has been.
Yeah, very well said, Brad. And a big part of the show, what I do here is I bring on these guys that have accomplished so much in their life, yet they state that it's been through the experience of becoming a father that's given them the greatest sense of fulfillment in life. And I think far too often we see, I especially hear it, I drive Uber on the weekends for many years, and I listen to these young men that have this terrible outlook on becoming a father, starting a family. They look at it as something they should avoid and put off at all costs, and it's not something they want to embrace. And I think we got to get that philosophy changed around somehow. And I love what you're doing here with The Complete Gentleman. Hit my listeners with a little bit about this. This is the third edition that you're doing here, The Modern Man's Guide to Chivalry. What is the book about? What can the readers expect when they get it? And why did you decide to write it?
I had been with my older son when he was about 10 years old, as at a screening of Titanic, James Cameron's blockbuster movie. And there's a scene in that film in which the character playing Benjamin Guggenheim, a real man who died on that big boat in 1912, he comes up dressed in his finery, like white tie and tails, and along with his manservant, who's also dressed finely. And a steward says to them, "Mr. Guggenheim, you've got to get on a life jacket. This boat's about to sink." And he said, "Yes, I know. We're dressed in our best, though, and prepared to go down like gentlemen." Back in the theater, a few rows, there were some young people who began to laugh. And I thought to myself, why on earth would they laugh? And I knew right away that it was the word gentleman that caused them to laugh. Now, partly it was that he was dressed the way he was, but they thought he was absurd. What I thought I was seeing was an expression of courage and a certain kind of aplomb that, to some extent, we've lost these days. So that and a few other things got me thinking this would be a good idea. A publisher had reached out to me and said, "We'd love to publish a book by you. We don't really care what the book is. We want it to be a book by you." And this was right after this had happened in the theater. And so I just said, "What about a book about how to be a gentleman and what a gentleman is and the history of gentlemen?" And indeed, they said yes right away. And so off I went. This was back in about 1999.
Yeah, and so much of this, obviously, I think in our culture here, Brad, has been lost. I mean, a lot of this entire thing we're seeing right now, the term toxic masculinity is constantly being thrown around. They're making it seem almost as if it's shameful to be proud to be a man or to be a masculine man. They're making that seem as if that's something that's a horrifying thing. And to me, I don't really understand what toxic masculinity is. I really don't get what they're trying to get across there. To me, I talk about the fatherless crisis on my show a lot. We have so many kids growing up without a father or a father figure in their life, and that's having a devastating result on our society. So to me, a toxic man would represent somebody that has children and walks away from that responsibility. To me, I would consider that to be a toxic type of man. What is your view here on this toxic masculinity, and what is that doing to our culture here?
It's hurting our culture tremendously, and the concept itself is nonsense. I know that there are bad men out there. When it comes to fathers, there were some great fathers. I think I was a great father. My sons think I was a great father. But I know that I've known a number of men, particularly professional men, who've been indifferent fathers, haven't spent a lot of time with their sons, haven't seen themselves as key in developing the character of these young men who are now in their charge, boys who will become men. But there's nothing toxic about the relationship between fathers and sons. It's essential. We know from just the way the world is created, whether you're taking a religious view or a secular view, it's obvious that men and women are made for one another for the purpose of having children. And so whether it's sons or daughters or sons and daughters, the responsibility of a man to do that, to embrace that role, also to be, I think, a good husband, which is what the very best situation is for these children. That's essential. It is at the heart of civilization. You can't imagine life without the coupling of men and women and the coming into life of children. Without that, we have nothing. Now, there are a lot of people, of course, part of what's behind the whole toxic masculinity thing is a certain kind of worldview that says, you know what, the problem with the earth is people. We pollute, we crowd, we do all sorts of things that we really shouldn't be doing. So the earth would be better without us. But I don't know. I mean, that's so utterly and is existentially self-destructive. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I guess we would never know if it was or not. If we were all gone, we'd never know if the earth made it better or if it made it worse. You know, there'd be nobody around to tell. But
well, nature is plenty. Nature is plenty rough too. There's a lot of toxicity in nature. I mean, it's red in tooth and claw, as a philosopher of the Middle Ages once described it. That's what nature is. Nature is tough.
Yeah, 100%, Brad. And I've had gay dads on the show here, and it's even though that they're raising their children with two men instead of a husband and a wife, they still take on these roles. They're still taking on. There's a softer role and a harder role. I think no matter who decides to play what role, children need to have both sides of that coin growing up, and if they don't get it. I think that's what we're seeing. Like I referred to the fatherless crisis. If you don't have, I grew up as a kid, hey, wait till your father gets home. And that was enough of a threat to make me say, hey, maybe I should think twice before I do this. And when you don't have that kind of discipline or that kind of a threat, I think it makes you feel like you can just get away with anything and there's no consequences. We've seen this. Every kid gets a trophy philosophy that's been a colossal failure in our culture. And then it leads into the adulthood. Now we see so many people that expect to do nothing and get rewarded for it. We're seeing that with the unemployment right now. People would rather stay home and collect money than go out and work and get something as a result. So I think that we see that starting at the young age with the kids. And as speaking about discipline, what type of disciplinarian were you as a dad with the kids growing up? And is that different than the discipline style that you grew up with?
Well, yeah, in one regard, I got spanked a lot when I was a little boy. I never spanked my sons. I don't believe in that. I don't think it's helpful. I spoke sharply to them on many occasions when I thought they were doing things that were not helpful to the family, not good for themselves. But I think discipline for us in this house was always a matter of putting things in the appropriate order each day, the time for rising, the speed with which they would be able to get ready for school when they got to school age. But also, there was always a strong intellectual discipline in our house. My wife she's retired now, but was a very well-known editor. I was also, both in magazine and book publishing. And so their lives growing up were filled with books. And it was the best part of every day for the four of us when we would sit down together to read. And we read book after book after book from the time they were toddlers right up until we used to have them together in one bedroom in this house in bunk beds. And when they got to be about middle school age, we realized it was important to give them their own room. So we split the bunk beds and put them into different rooms. And by that time, they were both voracious readers. And so they had plenty of books stacked up in their rooms to read. And I went to every practice, dropped them off anyway. You don't want to, if you're a dad, best not to hang around the practices. Better, you go to the games, but don't hang around the practices too much. And we shared some athletic stuff together. We all three did martial arts together. And, that to me, building specific kinds of discipline, intellectual and physical, helps in terms of the moral ordering of their lives. And also, of course, around the dinner table, there was always lively conversation, but real attention to table manners, because manners are minor morals. They're sort of your introduction into how you're going to behave around other people. And so that's sort of a quick description of what discipline was like in the Minor house.
Yeah, good stuff, Brad. And I love what you say there. Yeah, sitting at the dinner table and praying before dinner is the most important part of my day. It's the best part. I have 4 kids myself, so the 6 of us always eat dinner together. And what you said there about reading, I'm a big reader myself, and I've tried to give that to my kids as well. And that's another one of these things where I'll ask a lot of these young guys to get into the car when I'm driving Uber, and a lot of them are in college or just post college, and I'll ask them, hey, what book are you reading? And they always think it's a joke. Like the kids, they're not reading, they don't have an interest in it. And I think that's another thing that we're seeing that's causing some issues as well. And you mentioned here about your faith and all that stuff too. Like I mentioned, we pray before dinner every day together. How important has your faith been in how much of a role did it play in your upbringing of your kids?
Oh, a lot, because of course it's reflected really in everything I do. They were older when I was for a couple of years very sick, and my faith sustained me through a couple of different cancer treatments. And they observed that, as I say, somewhat from a distance. They were both in college at that point, and even out, actually, in case of my older son, who went to West Point. But they know, Dad is going to church today. They would come with me on Sundays, but not necessarily during the week. As a Roman Catholic, I have an opportunity to go to Mass a couple of times a day, every day if I want to. You only go once a day, at most, but nonetheless, they watched that. And they also understood that I saw God as the ordering principle in not just my life, but our lives. And I'm often asked in talking about this book whether or not I think an atheist can be a gentleman. And I think he can, but part of the reason he can is because he grew up in this culture, which is, whether you agree with it or not, is suffused with the Judeo-Christian point of view about life. And so most people have a moral sense that's based on either Judaism or Christianity in the United States. And obviously our mostly new Muslim residents also have a moral background that is very important to them. And so all of that is in culture. So exposing them to culture for me, and in the books we read, C.S. Lewis, for instance, The Chronicles of Narnia, was one of the key books, and his book Mere Christianity, and other things that we read that were, as I say, suffused with faith. I think it's a very important part of their, not only their upbringing, but their character today, even though neither of my sons is as religious as their dad.
Well, I agree with you. And I think that combining that with what I said, like the fatherless issue that we have, also God has been removed from so much of our society here. I think those two things alone, if we could strengthen both of those, I think that all these issues that we're seeing would start to go away. I mean, I think we're focusing on all these other social issues, but at the core of it is our nuclear families and our faith. And if we just strengthen those, I think we'll do ourselves a big justice. And the important thing for me here, Brad, my oldest is 15. I have 13, 10, and 6. And my most important goal here, I have 3 boys. I want them to get to the position where when they go to somebody else's house to date a woman or to date a girl, that their parents will come away impressed and feel comfortable that, hey, I'm all right with this guy dating my daughter. I want them to be that. I want them to have those morals, those values, the please, the thank you, to represent themselves as gentlemen. And that's my goal as a dad, to bring them up. And you've been there and done that yourself. You've got a grandkid. How did you kind of handle it when your boys became old enough to hit that dating scene? What kind of advice did you give them, or how did you kind of navigate them through those times?
Well, that respect for others begins with self-respect. Taught them that they needed to have a vision of their future. And, a pregnant girlfriend is not the vision of the future you want. A girlfriend who says he's a creep is not the kind of, person you want to be. I would always inform them that they should not get lost in the eyes of another person. They should retain their dignity and their individuality, but recognizing that it's always important in the first instance to put others first. And as long as that self-respect you have is reflected in respecting other people, then I think you're fine. And so we had a sex talk at one point, because you got to do that. But more important, it was a matter of recognizing that you must not objectify the individual across from you. You have to try and see from inside that person, because with particularly teenage girls, I think it's a volatile mix, a teenage boy and a teenage girl. She's still searching for identity. He's now, feeling the power of what's welling up inside of him, so to speak. And I think they got it. They both got it. It was, when my older son got married back in 2018, I mean, his in-laws were just so thrilled, to get this young man, a former Army officer, and he's a marvelous guy, and as so many West Pointers are.
Yeah, awesome stuff, Brad. And then getting right back into the book here, the Complete Gentleman. What is the third edition? What is separates this from the previous editions of the book, and where can the listeners find it?
Well, Amazon's always the best place to find things, I've found. The big differences are, first of all, that the book had gone out of print. And so it was important for me to get it back into print. But a lot of the things that we've talked about, toxic masculinity, the rise of a kind of irresponsible politics, the toxicity in our politics, the degradation people are able to have on subjects of religion and politics. There's a lot more of that in this third edition than there were either in the second edition or the original book. And I try with this book not just to be prescriptive, but descriptive. So I begin by talking about Titanic, about that incident in the theater, but also about what happened on that night in April the 14th and 15th, 1912, and what it meant for people to give up their lives for others. And then I talk about three archetypes in the book: the warrior, the lover, and the monk. And I tell the history from the earliest glimmerings of chivalry in the Middle Ages right up until the 21st century. Examples of what has been good and what has not been good, because it isn't always a happy story. I'm not trying to, cheer people up. It's important to look level-eyed right at the truth. But this grand tradition that began with chivalry, Knights of the Round Table, and all of that, right up until the warrior ethos in the 19th and 20th centuries, and up till today. And I don't believe that every man. I think the warrior ethos is very important. It's a very important part of what I'm calling the complete gentleman, because he is a modern chivalrous man. And chivalry was always first and foremost the worldview of fighting men. But you don't have to be a martial artist or a soldier, a Marine, an aviator, a sailor. You can be someone who simply works hard to make the world a better place. You need a warrior mentality for that. And so, and then the lover's pretty obvious. The dynamic between men and women has also changed, and changed even more so over the last 5 or 6 years than back when I first started writing the book in 1999. And so I needed to address all of that, bring it up to date. And now I have a great publisher in Regnery Gateway, and I'm very pleased with what's happening. I'm talking to you. How bad could it be?
Yeah, hey, listen, I think it's so needed in our society, in our culture right now. We got to bring the gentleman back. I mean, I think, like I say, I try to lead by example with my kids. They see the way I treat their mom, and I just try, just the little things, holding the door open for a girl, making her walk on the inside of the sidewalk when you're walking down the street. Just
Exactly.
These simple things, trying to just drill into them now, so hopefully it stays with them for in the future. And we definitely need it. We definitely need strong men back in our society here. I love what you're doing and what you bring to the table. What's next for you here, Brad? You got any other books in the work here? What kind of goals you have here for yourself for the future?
Yeah, I'm writing a novel. I've decided that I want to. I knew slightly Tom Wolfe, the great American novelist, who wrote Bonfire of the Vanities, is his most famous novel, I think. But in any case, Tom was a great nonfiction writer, wrote a lot of nonfiction books, including The Right Stuff. And then he got to a point in his life where he said, you know what, I don't want to do all that research and stuff. I'm just going to draw on my experiences and tell stories. And that's what I want to do. The Complete Gentleman, in all its editions, but especially in the third, is full of stories. Some of them come from my life. Some come from other lives. Some come from, the bibliography runs to 6 or 8 pages in the book. And I cite 150 different sources that I studied during the writing of the book. But I think now I just want to take it easy at my own pace, not be under any deadlines. I'm on a deadline every day at the Catholic thing, because I'm the one sort of who works on the back end and gets all the columns that we publish. We publish a new column every day. And so it's my responsibility to get that into our back end software, and also to add in a piece of beautiful art every day. Because a part of the grand tradition of Christian culture is the art that has been created. So we try and emphasize that. So anyway, that's what it's up to. I'm trying to take it easy. I'm 73 years old. So, I'm at a point in my life where it's time for me to, I'm not going to retire exactly, but it's time for me to take it a little bit easier.
Well, you're still crushing it, Brad. So it's great to see what you're doing, what you got coming up. And the last thing I want to hit you with here, I'd love to ask all the dads that I get on the podcast, what type of advice do you have for that new dad, or for that about-to-be father who's out there listening?
You won't be a new dad long. You just cannot imagine how quickly they change. I see it in my granddaughter now. We do a Zoom call every Sunday with them. They live in Denver right now, and we see her changing dramatically. You've got to be there. You've got to be present. You've got to give time. It's not an accomplishment simply to have been a father in the biological sense. You have to be a father in the emotional, spiritual, and intellectual sense as well. You've got to be with your children. And that's the best advice I can give.
Yeah, very well said. I love the message. This has been a lot of fun for me. I got to say, Brad Minor, you're a first-class father all the way. And thank you so much for giving me a few minutes of your time here on First Class Fatherhood.
My pleasure, Alec. Thank you for having me on.